Hello, welcome to episode 2. Today we're going to be setting up and starting to present the formal argument for the existence of God the Creator. However, it's going to be far from complete by the time this segment is over, so please don't expect a total picture from this episode alone. We are doing this in small, little bite-sized chunks, which seems to be the preferred method nowadays. We're going through a step-by-step process, and I humbly ask you, please put aside any preconceived notions you may have about this subject, and sit back, be patient, enjoy this step-by-step process as it slowly unfolds. Now, my father of blessed memory, before he would speak at a family gathering or a community function, many times he'd make the same joke. He would say, before I speak, I'd like to say a few words. So, before I speak, before I actually get into the presentation, I'd like to say a few words. If we were doing this the proper way, before we start, we'd have a full introduction outlining the philosophical underpinnings and the philosophical paradigms of such a discussion. Now, in my book, Nonsense of a High Order, The Confused World of Modern Atheism, I actually have a full chapter on it. It's chapter 2. It's called The Ground Rules, Guidelines for Discussing the Existence of God. It covers 14 pages and 7 very important points. For a number of different reasons, I've decided not to format our series this way. And we're going to have to deal with some of these important so-called ground rules on the fly as the presentation continues. However, before we get into the meat of the issue, there are 3 very important points I need to emphasize. Number 1, this series is not about Scripture. It's not about divine revelation. It is about the existence of God, and later on the proposition that the purpose of our lives revolves around forming a relationship with this God. Let me put it a different way, and I wrote this in the book also. Within the paradigms of this series, I am a missionary for belief in God. Not a particular religion, not a particular scripture, and not a particular revelation narrative. Number 2, the age of the universe is not part of our discussion here. It would be well beyond our scope and also a distraction for us to start discussing what Judaism's view on this subject is. So, completely sidestepping the issue of what the Torah says or what the Torah doesn't say about the age of the universe, we are going, for our simplicity's sake, we're going to work with standard scientific chronology that the universe came into existence some 14.5 billion years ago, and that life began, depending on, of course, who you ask, between 3.3 and 3.8 billion years ago. Because what's a couple of 100 million years between friends anyway? And 3, this is something that I mentioned a little bit last week, I should say the last episode. We are not concerned here with Darwinian evolution. I don't want there to be any misunderstanding. Personally, I happen to think that the evidence is nowhere near adequate to support the claims that it makes. However, for the purposes of our discussion, and for argument's sake, I am perfectly content to concede the truth of neo-Darwinian theory. We are simply going to bypass Darwinian evolution. We will demonstrate that not only is evolution irrelevant to our question, it actually begs the question. Our main focus now is the origin of life. And interestingly enough, after I came to that conclusion a number of years ago, I found someone on the other side who enthusiastically or clearly agrees with me. John Horgan is a very well-known science writer. He is a senior writer for Scientific American, and he wrote the following, quote, "If I were a creationist, I would cease attacking the theory of evolution and instead focus on the origin of life. This is by far the weakest strut in the chassis of modern biology. The origin of life is a science writer's dream. It abounds with exotic scientists and exotic theories which are never entirely abandoned or accepted, but merely go in and out of fashion." End of quote. Now, what exactly did John Horgan mean when he said that the origin of life is the weakest strut in the chassis of modern biology? What he meant, of course, is that it is the weakest strut in an atheistic view of biology, one that totally leaves God, the creator, out of the picture. But John Horgan is seriously mistaken. Origin of life is not the weakest strut. We will soon find out that it is a strut that does not exist at all, leaving atheistic science with a foundation of nothing but thin air and wishful thinking. What we need to understand before continuing is that Darwinian evolution and origin of life are fundamentally and conceptually separate areas of science and need to be investigated and understood in totally different ways. And by the way, on that point, there is no scientific controversy. Evolution is in the category of biology, the study of living things. The essential scientific discipline needed for the investigation of origin of life, however, is chemistry. In other words, how did non-living chemicals come together, coalesce, and form the astoundingly complex and sophisticated nanotechnological machinery of the living cell, and the even more astounding DNA genetic digital information processing system of the living cell? Now, for those of you who are still not quite sure the difference, the following metaphor will help illustrate things. And with this, we're going to close today's episode. In World War II, automobile manufacturing plants, like let's say you had an assembly line that was producing Cadillacs, these assembly lines were retooled, modified, and reconfigured to produce Jeeps, half-tracks, and even tanks for the war effort. Modifying an automobile assembly line that's producing Cadillacs in order to produce half-tracks is roughly analogous to Darwinian evolution. In other words, you already have functioning machinery. It just has to be modified to get a different result, or you modify it and you end up with a different result. Origin of life, on the other hand, would be analogous to starting with raw materials, meaning trees, sand, iron ore, copper ore, clay, stone, transforming those raw materials into building materials like lumber, glass, steel beams, copper tubing, copper wires, bricks, nails, screws, rivets, power tools, construction machinery, and then putting all that together to build an automobile factory with a fully functioning assembly line, which could then be modified to produce something else. It's clear these are two totally different types of processes. In other words, modification of the assembly line can only take place after the plant is built and you have a fully functioning assembly line. Darwinian evolution can only take place after life begins. Neo-Darwinian theory does not even pretend to explain how life came about in the first place. And I'd like to remind you of something that I mentioned in episode 1, a statement by Professor Richard Dawkins, one of the leading figures in modern atheism. And he wrote this in his book, The God Delusion. Quote, Darwinian evolution proceeds merrily once life has originated. But how does life get started? And at this point, we can paraphrase that statement. Darwinian evolution, excuse me, proceeds once life has originated. But where does the astounding machinery of life that allows the Darwinian process to unfold come from in the first place? Looking forward to seeing you in episode 3. Take care, have a great day, and God bless.
Hoofbeats pounding on the prairie like thunder. Hear the whistle of a westbound train. Off in the distance rides a desperate young gunfighter, trying to make it home one last time. But it's all the same story. It's been that